Hi, everybody. This is Jay Moore. I'm the founder of the group The Ordinary Christian. And today I want to talk with you about a missional living perspective. I want to give you a perspective on missional living that involves civil disobedience. That's right, I'm talking about civil disobedience. Is there ever an appropriate time or appropriate way for Christians to exercise civil disobedience as part of their missional living? Now, let me share with you what I think about missional living. Missional living would include living a life in such a way where God gets the glory. So, another way of putting this, is there a place where we exercise civil disobedience to the authorities around us in a way that God can get the glory for it? So, to help us with this a little bit, I want us to take a look at two different examples, both taken out of the book of Daniel. The first one is dealing with those three wonderful Hebrew young men by the name of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who exercised civil disobedience to King Nebuchadnezzar. Because King Nebuchadnezzar had built an idol, big golden idol, and instructed that everybody in all of the kingdom was to fall down and worship God whenever they heard the flute and the lyre and the horns blowing, and they were to bow down and worship. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because of their convictions to not worship any other God, as God had commanded in the Ten Commandments, would not do it. They refused to bow down and worship. And as a result, the word got back to King Nebuchadnezzar. He was furious about it. He brought the three of them before him, and he says, listen to me, if you're willing to bow down right now, all is forgiven. But if you choose not to, I'm going to be angry with you. I'm going to heat up that furnace, and we're going to throw you in. And do you think your God can save you then? And we know the story. They said to the king, "O king, we are more than confident that God, our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is more than able, more than capable to save us from this fiery furnace that you're going to throw us into. But understand this, king, even if God chooses not to, we will not bow." The king got upset. He ordered them to heat up the furnace hotter than it had ever been. He instructed the strongest men to bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, tie them up, and to throw them in the furnace. And as they're throwing them into the furnace, the guards burn up and die. It's so hot. But then the king looks into the furnace, and what does he see? Not three, he sees four. And he says, "Didn't we just throw in three?" And they said, "Yes, O king." He says, "Why do I see four?" And the fourth one looks like one of the sons of God. And then he ordered them to come out. When he came out, they noticed that none of their clothes was singed. The hair wasn't singed. They didn't even smell like smoke. And Nebuchadnezzar says, you know what? There is no God that can save like the God of, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I make a decree, he said, that no one is to speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or they'll be thrown into the fiery furnace. Here we have a perfect example of three young men unwilling to do something that they knew they couldn't do according to God. They stood up, they exercised civil disobedience because understand, it was the law of the Babylonian government that everybody was to bow down and worship that idol. But they exercised civil disobedience. They did it in such a way that when God rescued them, that God redeemed them, God saved them, sure enough, God got the glory for it. The second example is with Daniel. You know, he's the fourth of the three of them. There were four of them. Daniel was kind of like the leader of them all. And there came a time when a different king, now it's a Persian king, had been tricked into enacting a law because the people who tricked him to do it wanted to entrap Daniel with something. And they said, King, let's pass a law that no one can pray to any other God except our gods for this period of time. And if they do, that they would have to be thrown into the lion's den according to the laws of the Persians, and it couldn't be repealed. And the king thought about it and thought it was a pretty good idea. He's not realizing the trickery that's going on, and he agrees to do it. And he enacts a law saying you can't pray to any other God except for the gods, my gods, and if you do, you're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. Well, Daniel's not going to do that. He's not going to pray to any other gods. He is going to pray to his God. But I think it's important to notice that Daniel didn't decide to go ahead and do what he would normally do quietly in the privacy of his own home, not in front of everybody, but instead he goes into his house, he opens up the window as he would usually do, and he prays in front of the window so everybody walking by can see him praying to the one true living, breathing God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Israel. And he prays to him. In disobedience to the law, civil disobedience to the law, Daniel did what he was told not to do. Sure enough, the king threw him into the fiery furnace reluctantly. He didn't want to, but he had said, according to the laws of the Persians, you have to do this, and the Medes. And he threw him in there. Couldn't sleep all night. Ran out there the next morning and opened up and said, Daniel, are you okay? And Daniel says, I am fine, O king. God had sent his angels to shut the lion's mouth. And he brought him out, and he publicly, the king publicly praised Daniel and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that Daniel served. Again, God got the glory for it. Why am I talking about this? Well, for a few reasons. There are some laws in the United States that are being passed that are going to try to cause Christians to shut up, to not speak up, to not share the gospel in public places. I was listening to a pastor who was sharing about how some of his church members who work in a public forum, it might be a courthouse, it may be in a school, some kind of public forum. It wasn't a private institution. It was a public place, a civil place. And they were said that they cannot talk about God there. But some other things were happening that he was excited about for them. And I'm thinking to myself, why? Because they would lose their job if they talked about it. It's not that they couldn't talk about God, it's that they chose not to talk about God. And this is happening all over America. Listen to me, follower of Christ. If you're living in the United States, it's not that you can't talk about Jesus. It's not that you can't pray in public. It's not that you can't do these things. It's that you are choosing not to because you do not want to suffer the consequences that might come from it. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were willing to suffer the consequences of doing what God had ordered them to do, or not doing what God had told them not to do. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and you're thinking to yourself, well, yeah, but God delivered them. Yeah, he did. That's the whole point. But they couldn't have been delivered from the fiery furnace unless they were thrown into the fiery furnace to begin with, because of their civil disobedience, and rather to obey God than to obey the king. He couldn't have been saved, Daniel, from the lion's den unless he was thrown in the lion's den first. You can't be saved by God. You can't see God's power, God's glory, God's provision unless you're willing to suffer the consequences of doing what God has told you to do, or not doing what God has told you not to do, even in the face of the laws of the land telling you you can't do this or you must do that. You got to be willing to exercise civil disobedience if you're going to experience the provision and the deliverance of God, and for God to get the glory for it. For God to get the glory. See, that's what it's really all about. But we got to have the same kind of mentality that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who said, we're more than confident that our God can save us from the fiery furnace. But understand this, O king, even if he chooses not to, we will not bow. God may not save your job even if you share Jesus in that place. You may lose your job and it may be taken from you. But will God still provide for you? Absolutely. He's already promised that. Maybe he'll provide different. Maybe God wants you to exercise such faith and to suffer the consequences so that you are now placed into a position to share even greater for God. I want to encourage us. Let's not be intimidated by our government. Let us not be intimidated by the authorities if they are opposing God, if they are opposing and telling us we can't do what God has already commanded us to do. See, I honestly believe I do not need to ask permission from men to do what God has already commanded me to do. I have been commanded by God to go make disciples. I have been commanded to God to be a witness of his resurrection, of his power to transform lives. I have been commanded from God, and there's not a man on earth has the authority to supersede God's command for me to do what he's told me to do. The only way that happens is if I allow it to, and if you allow it to in your life. Let's trust God. Let's go out and live that powerful missional life, understanding that we may have to do it in face of opposition to our own government. All right, take care. God bless you. This is Jay Moore. I'm the founder of the Ordinary Christian. That is my missional living perspective on civil disobedience and living a missional life. If you haven't already done so, I want to encourage you to go ahead and sign up for the newsletter, free newsletter we send out from the Ordinary Christian. Just hit the link below and give us your name, email address, and we'll get you all signed up. All right, take care. God bless you. We'll talk to you next time on the Ordinary Christian.